The kiss before the gallows. If you had walked through that dusty western town on the day Carol Joy kissed a condemned outlaw, you would have sworn she was the least likely woman to do such a thing. She wore gray. Always gray. Gray dresses, fashioned from serviceable cotton or wool depending on the season, were buttoned to her throat with a precision that suggested a fear of exposure. Gray gloves, mended at the fingertips, covered her hands. Gray ribbons pinned her blonde hair so tightly at the nape of her neck it never dared fall loose. Not even when the hot winds blew. She walked with her eyes lowered behind thin, wire-rimmed spectacles, as though the world were a dense and difficult book she preferred not to look up from. Her gaze was for the cracked wooden sidewalk, for the dust on her hem, for the open primer in her lap. It was never for the rough men who loitered outside the saloon, or the women who watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. No one would have imagined she would one day press her mouth to a man scheduled to hang at dawn. It would have been as incongruous as a snowflake in the forge, a hymn in the whorehouse. But sometimes the quietest women are the ones holding the deepest storms. And on that sweltering afternoon in the late summer of 1853, Carol Joy was walking straight into one. The town of Briar's Hollow shimmered beneath a merciless sun. It was a place that seemed to have been thrown together as an afterthought, a collection of clapboard buildings huddled on a flat stretch of dust. The air was thick and heavy, clinging to the skin like a damp shroud. It carried the scent of horse sweat from the livery stable, the sharp tang of tobacco from the men on the porch of the mercantile, and the ever-present acrid smell of sun-baked earth. Storefront signs, their paint blistered and faded, creaked on rusted hinges in the occasional breath of hot wind. From the blacksmith's yard, the rhythmic clang of a hammer striking metal rang out with a dull, percussive monotony. Carol kept her gloved hands clasped tightly in front of her, the fingers interlaced so firmly the knuckles paled. The walk from the small schoolhouse to the sheriff's office was not a long one, barely 300 yards. But today it felt like a pilgrimage across a desert. She had rehearsed her speech at least 12 times. She had polished the words until they were smooth and reasonable, a small, firm pebble of a request she could place calmly on the sheriff's desk. It was a small matter, really. A few ranch boys, the Culpepper twins, and that loutish Simmons boy, had been disrupting her classroom for weeks. It had started with paper wads sailing through the air during arithmetic, progressed to whispered crude jokes that made the other students giggle and blush, and had culminated in a campaign of mockery aimed at her soft, quiet voice. Yesterday, one of the Culpepper boys had stood up and mimicked the way she adjusted her spectacles. A slow, precise push up the bridge of her nose, to the raucous laughter of the entire room. She had felt the laughter like a physical blow, a hot flush of shame that crept up her neck and stained her cheeks. She was not a woman prone to complaints. Her mother had raised her to endure, to be pleasant, to be grateful for her position. But she would not, could not, allow her classroom to become a circus. It was the only domain she had, and she would defend it. So she climbed the 3 wooden steps to the sheriff's office, with a resolve that trembled like a caged bird beneath her ribs. The steps groaned under her modest weight. The door, warped by the sun, stuck for a moment, before giving way with a soft screech. The office smelled of ink, dust, and the ghost of stale whiskey that had soaked into the floorboards years ago and never quite left. Sunlight, thick as honey, filtered through 2 grimy windows, cutting thin golden lines across the plank floor. A heavy oak desk sat near the center, its surface a chaotic terrain of wanted posters, coffee-ringed circulars, and a half-empty bottle. A dusty hat hung on a peg by the door. The place felt large, empty, and oppressively still. Sheriff?" she called, her voice a timid thing that seemed to be swallowed by the silence. No answer. She stepped further inside, her gaze sweeping the room. The pot-bellied stove was cold. The spittoon in the corner was dry. And then she heard it. A soft metallic scrape, the sound of iron shifting against iron. Carol froze. The jail cell sat in the rear of the office, a cage of rust-streaked bars behind the sheriff's desk. She had known, of course, that the outlaw was being held there. The whole town had been buzzing about it for days, the story growing more lurid with each telling. Jamie Lawless. Highway robber. Suspected of holding up 3 stagecoaches, of stealing the payroll for the mines up at Silver Creek. Condemned by a judge who had ridden into town specifically for the trial. To hang. At sunrise tomorrow. She had never seen him up close. She had only heard the whispers, the fear and fascination in the townsfolk's voices. Until now. He sat on a narrow cot in the single cell, his back against the rough stone wall. His elbows rested loosely on his knees, his wrists shackled in heavy iron linked by a short chain. He was larger than she expected. Even seated, his height was evident. Broad shoulders, honed by hard living, strained against a faded cotton shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. His dark hair, thick and unwashed, fell in uneven strands around a strong brow and the hollows of his cheeks. A dark beard shadowed his jaw, but it was his eyes that struck her still. They lifted and locked onto hers the moment she entered his line of sight. They were a bright, startling aqua blue, a color that seemed impossible in this dusty, monochrome town. Not pale and watery, not soft. They were sharp, intelligent, and utterly, vibrantly alive. In a face shadowed by exhaustion and the proximity of death, those eyes burned with an undimmed intensity. "Well," he said, his voice a low rasp, like gravel warmed by a long day's sun. It carried easily across the small space. "I was startin' to think I'd been forgotten." Carol's heart, already unsteady, began to pound so loudly she felt the pulse throb in her temples and feared he might hear it from across the room. I beg your pardon," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She took a cautious step backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the door latch behind her. He tilted his head slightly, his aqua gaze studying her with an unnerving thoroughness. From the tip of her scuffed boots to the gray ribbon in her hair. "You here to watch the monster in his cage, miss?" The question was simple, yet it demanded an answer. She was rooted to the spot. "Joy," she replied automatically, her voice a little stronger. "Carol Joy." His mouth curved faintly at the corner. It wasn't quite a smile, more a flicker of acknowledgement. "Joy," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "That's a fine thing to carry around." She swallowed, the dryness in her throat making it difficult. The compliment, if it could be called that, felt strangely profound, spoken by a man in chains. "I am here to speak with the sheriff," she clarified, the words coming out more defensive than she intended. "Sheriff's at supper," he said, with the air of someone stating an obvious, immutable fact. "Over at the boarding house. Mrs. Gables. Gets himself a plate of her stew every evening at 5:30. Been listening to his routine for 3 days now." Of course he was. Of course the sheriff was calmly eating stew while she stood here, flustered and trembling in front of a condemned man. Carol glanced toward the door, considering a swift retreat. But she had walked all this way. She had endured the laughter of those boys. She would not flee like a frightened child from a man behind bars. It would be a small, private defeat she could not afford. So she drew herself up to her full, unimpressive height, 5 feet and 2 inches, and clasped her hands so tightly in front of her that the gray gloves stretched taut over her knuckles. "I shall wait." His gaze lowered then, just briefly, traveling from her clasped hands to the modest cut of her dress. It was enough to make her acutely, painfully aware of herself, of the shapeless gray fabric that concealed curves she had been taught, from her earliest memories, were something shameful to be hidden, a source of sin rather than beauty. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Decent women are modest women, Carol. A man's look is a claim you do not want staked." He did not leer. He did not undress her with his eyes. He simply observed. It was a quiet, considering assessment, and that somehow felt more dangerous than any crude stare. It felt like he was seeing past the gray, past the gloves, past the tightly pinned hair. "You're the schoolteacher," he said after a long moment. It wasn't a question. "Yes, the one the ranch boys keep botherin'." Her eyes widened in surprise. "How do you?" "News travels through walls," he replied lightly, rattling his chains with a small, dismissive lift of his wrist. The sound was jarring, a brutal reminder of his circumstance. "Nothin' else to do in here but listen. Heard the sheriff and his deputy talkin' about it. Seems them Culpepper boys are a menace to more than just their cows." She flushed, a mixture of embarrassment that her private trouble was public knowledge, and a strange, uncomfortable feeling that this outlaw now knew something personal about her. "I have come to request that the sheriff speak to their fathers," she said, clinging to the official purpose of her visit. "Must be bad then. For you to come here." He said it without mockery, just a statement of fact. "It is disruptive to the other children's learning." She was parroting the speech she had prepared. A corner of his mouth lifted again, a flicker of what might have been amusement in other circumstances. "That what's got you so nervous? Them boys? I am not nervous." He leaned back slightly against the wall, stretching his shoulders with a casual grace that belied the irons on his wrists. His eyes dropped pointedly to her hands. "Your hands are shaken." She looked down. He was right. The knuckles of her clasped fingers were white, but the fingers themselves trembled against her stomach. She quickly folded them even tighter, pressing them into the fabric of her dress as if to still them by force. "I do not make a habit of entering establishments such as this," she said, her voice a little too high. He didn't mock her for the prim phrasing. "Such as this," he echoed, letting the words hang in the air. "A jail." He smiled then, a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the skin at their corners. It was a startlingly handsome smile, and it made her breath catch. "First time for everything, Miss Joy." Silence fell between them, thick and strange and charged. It was not an empty silence. It was filled with the afternoon heat, the dust motes dancing in the golden light, the weight of his gaze, and the iron bars that both separated them and, paradoxically, seemed to draw them into a private world. Carol became acutely aware of the sound of her own breathing, of the faint, rapid pulse fluttering in her throat, of the sheer, startling maleness of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the dark hair at his open collar, the raw power evident even in his stillness. He was nothing like the men she knew. The ranchers were weathered and gruff, the shopkeepers soft and harried. The boys in her classroom were just that, boys. Jamie Lawless was something else entirely. He was danger made flesh, caged, and waiting for death. He studied her with that quiet intensity, a look that seemed to peel back layers she had spent a lifetime building. "You don't look like someone who comes in here often," he said softly, his voice a low murmur that seemed meant only for her. "I assure you, I do not. You look like someone who's never done a single reckless thing in her life." The words struck her harder than any insult could have. They hit a raw, exposed nerve she hadn't even known was there. Because they were true. Or at least, they had been. Her entire existence had been a carefully constructed fortress against recklessness. Recklessness was what had led her father to gamble away their savings. Recklessness was what had gotten her sister into trouble and sent her away in shame. Carol Joy was the sensible one, the reliable one, the one who would never cause a moment's distress. Until recently, she had even thought she was the one who would be chosen. Mordecai's voice echoed unbidden in her mind, a wound that had not yet healed. "You are pleasant, Carol. Kind. A good Christian woman. But there is nothing in you that stirs a man. No spark, no fire. I cannot marry a woman who feels like lukewarm tea." He had said it with a gentle, almost regretful smile, as though he were explaining a difficult arithmetic problem to a slow student. She had stood there in her gray dress, in her aunt's parlor, nodding politely, as though being dismissed from an engagement after 2 years were akin to being excused from a dance. She had waited until he left before she let the tears come, silent and hot, into her pillow. Her throat tightened now at the memory, a sharp ache that she quickly tried to suppress. "I do not see recklessness as a virtue," she said carefully, her voice steadier than she felt. "Maybe not," Jamie replied, his gaze never leaving her face. "But sometimes it reminds you you're alive." His gaze dropped to her mouth. The air in the room seemed to shift, to thicken. The temperature climbed another impossible degree. Carol's pulse stumbled, then raced. He noticed. She saw it in the way his eyes flickered, in the slight change in his expression. The teasing glint faded, replaced by something more focused, more intent. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I hang tomorrow," he said quietly. The bluntness of the words, the stark reality of them, stole her breath completely. "I am aware," she whispered. The whole town was aware. They were probably building the gallows right now, hammering the wood that would hold his weight at dawn. "Sunrise," she swallowed, her throat convulsing. "Then perhaps you ought to spend your remaining hours in prayer." "Already did." He said it without irony, a simple statement. "Spent the first night doing just that. Felt like I talked myself hoarse, talking to a sky I couldn't see. Now," he trailed off, his shoulders lifting in a slight shrug. She did not know how to respond to that. What did one say to a man on the precipice of eternity? He rose slowly from the cot. The movement was fluid, unhurried. Even shackled, he was tall, taller than any man she had stood close to before. He seemed to fill the space, his presence pushing against the edges of the small office. Broad through the chest, strong in a way that felt contained, like a coiled spring. He approached the bars. She should step back. Every instinct of self-preservation, every lesson of propriety screamed at her to retreat to the door. But she remained exactly where she was, rooted by a force she couldn't name. Iron bars separated them, but barely 2 feet of space lay between the gray wool of her bodice and the rusted metal. Up close, she could see the details she had missed from across the room. The faint, thin white line of a scar along his left cheekbone, the darker ring of midnight blue around the irises of his aqua eyes, the slight shadow of stubble on his strong jaw, the rise and fall of his chest beneath the worn shirt, a rhythm that seemed unnervingly calm for a man facing the gallows. "I ain't asking for forgiveness," he said, his voice pitched lower now, intimate, meant only for the space between them. "And I ain't asking you to believe I'm innocent. I'm not asking you to save me, or write to my ma, or any of those things." "Then what are you asking?" The question was out before she could stop it, a breathless whisper. His brilliant blue eyes held hers, unwavering. "For one kindness." Her breath caught in her chest, a small, sharp hitch. What sort of kindness?" He did not look away when he answered. He didn't smile or leer. He just looked at her, and said the word with a simple, devastating honesty. "A kiss." The word seemed to echo in the hot, dusty room, bouncing off the walls and reverberating in her very bones. Carol felt a wave of heat flood her face, so swift and intense, she thought she might faint dead away on the spot. Her stomach dropped and then flipped. "That is wholly inappropriate," she managed to stammer, her voice a thread of sound. "I know. And presumptuous, probably." Her heart was a wild, frantic thing against her ribs. "You are a criminal. A highway robber." "Yes, ma'am. And a stranger." She was clinging to logic, to the known world, as it crumbled around her. Not entirely. His voice was soft. "I know your name. I know you teach children their letters. I know you've got a temper you keep locked up tight as a vault, else you wouldn't be here to fight for your classroom. I know you smell like lavender and paper." She should leave. Every rational thought commanded her to turn, to walk out the door, to go back to her safe gray life. She should, but she remained exactly where she was. "Why?" she asked faintly, the single word holding a universe of questions. "Why me? Why this? Why, when the world is about to end for you?" His expression shifted again, the last vestiges of playfulness gone. It was just him now, raw and open, a man staring into the abyss. "Because tomorrow, at sunrise, they'll drop that rope," he said, his voice roughening, a crack of vulnerability in the gravel. "And I'll go out of this world remembered as nothing but a thief, a story they tell to scare children. A monster in a cage." Silence pressed in, heavy and profound. "I just thought," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers, "maybe I'd like to know what it feels like to be kissed by someone who ain't afraid of me. Someone decent. Just once, before I go." Her breath trembled in her chest, a tiny, shaken thing. She looked at his eyes, so startlingly blue, and saw no deception there. Only a stark, human need that reached past all her defenses and touched something deep within her, a place that had been lonely for so long she had forgotten it existed. "I am not afraid of you," she whispered. His brow lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise. "No?" "No," she said, and it was only half a lie. She was afraid. Terrified. But not of him. She was afraid of herself, afraid of the storm she felt, stirring in the depths of her soul, beneath years of obedience and modesty, and careful, suffocating composure. Afraid of what might happen if she let it loose, even for a second. He stepped closer to the bars, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, a tangible force in the cool dimness of the office. "I ain't never asked nothin' of a decent woman before," he murmured, the words a rough confession. The way he said decent, with a kind of wonder, as if she were something sacred and unattainable, made her stomach tighten, with a feeling she didn't recognize. "I would not know how to," she started, a final, feeble protest. "You do." His voice softened to a near caress. "Just lean in." Her heart thundered so loudly she was certain it must echo off the walls, a frantic drumbeat announcing her complete and utter abandonment of sense. This was madness. Complete, utter, irredeemable madness. Improper. Unthinkable. The sort of thing that got decent women ruined, cast out, turned into cautionary tales themselves. And yet, tomorrow he would die. Mordecai had left her for being passionless, for being lukewarm tea. The town saw her as harmless, dull, safe, a gray woman in a gray dress. What would it feel like, just for one heartbeat, to be something else? She stepped forward, the cold iron bars pressed against the wool of her bodice, a stark, unyielding reality. He lifted his shackled hands, the chain clinking softly, and curled his fingers around the bars beside her shoulders. He wasn't touching her. He was waiting, giving her the choice, the power. Her breath, shallow and quick, brushed against his cheek. He smelled faintly of leather and cedar and sweat, a clean, distinctly male scent that was utterly foreign and intoxicating. Her spectacles, fogged by her own heat, slipped slightly down her nose. His gaze flicked to them. "Take 'em off," he murmured. The intimacy of the request, the quiet command in his voice, sent a shiver cascading down her spine. With trembling fingers, she reached up and removed them. The world behind her blurred into soft, indistinct shapes. But his eyes, those impossible aqua eyes, remained perfectly clear, inches from her own. She leaned in, their lips met. It was soft, tentative, warm. The contact was nothing like she had ever imagined a kiss could be. Not the violent, forceful claiming she had vaguely associated with outlaws. Not the peck she had once received from a shy suitor years ago. It was just heat. A gentle, electric pressure that sent a shockwave through her entire body. His mouth was firm but exquisitely careful, as though he were handling something infinitely precious and fragile, as though he feared frightening her away. Her entire being seemed to spark at once. A warmth, deep and liquid, unfurled low in her stomach. A feeling so foreign, so startlingly pleasant, it made her gasp softly against his lips. He inhaled sharply at the sound, and that small, ragged breath nearly undid her. For one suspended, eternal moment, she forgot the bars. She forgot the gallows. She forgot the gray dress, the mockery of the schoolboys, the crushing disappointment of Mordecai. She forgot who she was supposed to be. She was just a woman, kissing a man, and she kissed him back. Barely. A faint, responding pressure, a shy movement of her lips against his. But it was enough. Enough that his fingers tightened on the iron bars until the knuckles went white. Enough that a quiet, almost reverent sound, a groan, a sigh, she couldn't tell, left his throat and vibrated against her mouth. It was the most terrifying and wonderful thing she had ever felt. Then, boot steps. Heavy. Unmistakable. Crunching on the boardwalk outside, Carol jerked back as though burned. Her spectacles, clutched in her hand, nearly fell to the floor. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth, her lips still tingling with the ghost of his. Jamie stepped away from the bars in a single, fluid motion, returning to his cot and sitting down just as the door burst open. His face was calm, unreadable, a mask sliding back into place. The sheriff's boots thudded through the doorway, and he stopped short at the sight of her. "Well, Miss Joy," the sheriff said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, clearly unaware of the scene he had just interrupted. "What brings you in?" She could not breathe, could not form a single coherent thought. Her voice cracked and failed. She swallowed, the taste of him still on her lips. "The ranch boys, Sheriff." The words came out in a rush, a desperate grasp at normalcy. "The Culpepper boys. They are disrupting my classroom. I need you to speak with their fathers." The sheriff nodded, pulling out his chair with a scrape. "Ah, yes. Heard about that. I'll have a word with Tom Culpepper tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word was a knife. Tomorrow, the sun would rise, and a man would die. A man who had just kissed her. "Thank you, Sheriff," she whispered, not trusting her voice for more. She fled, her escape as swift and quiet as a shadow. Behind her, in the cell, Jamie Lawless said nothing, but she could feel his gaze on her back as she stumbled through the door, a phantom touch that followed her all the way down the steps, across the dusty street, and into the safety of her small gray room. That night, as the town of Briar's Hollow prepared for a hanging at dawn, as hammers fell silent on the gallows and the last drinks were poured in the saloon, Carol Joy lay awake staring at the ceiling. The moonlight traced the familiar cracks in the plaster. The silence was broken only by the distant yip of a coyote. She touched her mouth with her fingertips. Again. And again. It had not felt like pity. It had felt like an awakening, and somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, a man in chains would soon walk to the scaffold. But not before something inside Carol Joy, something she had kept caged her entire life, had begun to stir. And once awakened, it could not be easily put back to sleep. Briar's Hollow woke that next morning to the sound of the gallows, or rather, to the absence of it. No drop, no crowd, no sheriff calling order from the steps. Jamie Lawless had vanished from his cell sometime in the gray hour before dawn. The shackles lay on the cot, open and cold. The lock had not been forced. The bars had not been bent. He had simply ceased to be there, as though the night had taken him back into itself, and the gallows stood empty in the rising sun like a bad joke at the town's expense. Briar's Hollow talked about it for weeks. The how of it, the who of it, who had helped if anyone had, whether the devil himself had come to collect his own early. The sheriff rode out in 3 directions and found nothing. The circuit judge was livid. Wanted posters were printed and distributed across the territory, bearing the name Jamie Lawless above a description that was accurate in the particulars but missed, Carol Joy thought privately, the most important detail. It said nothing about his eyes. She told no one what she had done. She pressed her lips together and went back to her classroom and taught the children their letters, and the Culpepper boys behaved themselves for exactly 3 weeks after the sheriff's visit before reverting to form, and life in Briar's Hollow resumed its ordinary pace, and Carol Joy Aldridge resumed her gray life in her gray dress and was, to all appearances, entirely unchanged. She was not unchanged. The problem was this, she now knew. She had not known before, not truly, not in any way that lived in the body rather than in the pages of a novel, what it felt like to have a man look at her as though she were the only comprehensible thing in a difficult world. She had not known what it felt like to be kissed, as though she were something worth being careful with. She had not known what that warmth was, the one that had unfurled low in her stomach and had not, in the months since, entirely gone away. It came back at inconvenient moments, in the quiet of the schoolroom after the children had gone, in the dark of her bedroom when sleep would not come, when she passed the sheriff's office on her morning walk and caught herself glancing, involuntarily, at the barred window. It was inconvenient and persistent, and she had no name for it except longing, and she refused to call it that, because longing for a wanted man who had vanished into the western dark was not something a sensible schoolteacher did. She was sensible. She was a schoolteacher. She endured. A year passed. He arrived on a Tuesday in October, when the dust was the color of rust and the cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold, and the air had that first clean bite of autumn in it that Carol Joy had always loved. She saw him from the schoolroom window, a wagon, loaded under canvas, pulling down Main Street behind two broad-chested roans. The man on the bench was tall enough that even seated he had a different quality to him than the ordinary men of Briar's Hollow, a kind of vertical authority. Dark-haired, clean-shaven save for the close shadow of a beard that had been trimmed rather than grown. A good coat, a hat with a wider brim than was local habit. He was looking at the town with the steady, assessing gaze of a man who was in the practice of reading places quickly. Carol told herself she was looking at the wagon. Then he turned his head, and even from this distance, even across 40 feet of sunlit dust, she caught the color of his eyes, aqua. That specific, impossible blue that no geography book had done justice to. That color that had no business existing in a face like this, in a territory like this, in a world this brown and sun-bleached and ordinary. The ruler slipped from her fingers and clattered on the floor. "Miss Aldridge?" said little Annie Voss from the second row, looking up with wide eyes. "Continue your sums," Carol said, and retrieved the ruler, and did not look back out the window, and spent the remainder of the lesson conjugating verbs with a precision that the children found both impressive and mildly terrifying. His name, she learned through the reliable current of Briar's Hollow gossip, was Caleb McGee, 29 years old, come from Kansas City, where he had run a dry goods operation before selling it and heading west with a wagon of new stock and the intention of establishing a general merchant trade. He was unmarried. He was easy in manner. He had cash money, or the appearance of it, which in Briar's Hollow amounted to the same thing in terms of welcome. Within a week, he was the most discussed man in town. Within 2 weeks, he had a storefront between the barber and the land office, and was already open for trade. And the women of Briar's Hollow had begun arriving at his counter with shopping lists that were somewhat longer than strictly necessary. Carol Joy avoided him with a focus that was itself suspicious. Had anyone been watching carefully enough? She turned the evidence over in her mind with the methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. His height. His eyes. The particular way he tilted his head when listening. She had observed it, from the street, through the window of his shop. Angling slightly as though to hear better, a gesture so specific she could have drawn it from memory because she had been drawing it from memory for 12 months. The scar along his left cheekbone, faint and white, just visible when the light caught it correctly. She was certain. And then she sat in her kitchen with Prescott the cat on the table, and thought about what to do with her certainty. She thought about iron bars and aqua eyes, and the way a man's hands could shake on cold metal, and she made her decision. She said nothing. Some people, she believed, quietly, privately, in the part of her shaped more by novels than sermons, deserved the chance to become something other than the worst thing they had ever done. And this man, whoever he was now, had come back, to a town where he'd been condemned to hang. That was either extraordinary stupidity or something braver than she could calculate, and she had never been able to dismiss bravery. She put on her gray dress the next morning and walked to school, and resolved, firmly, to stay well away from Caleb McGee. She lasted 4 days. He found her in the lending library. She had come to return 2 books and collect one she'd reserved, and she was reaching for the top shelf, always the top shelf, always requiring the indignity of rising on her toes, when a long arm appeared above her, easy and unhurried, and retrieved the volume without effort. "This one," said a voice, low and warm and carrying a roughness she recognized from a jail cell on a sweltering afternoon. She turned. He was closer than she'd anticipated. The aqua eyes were level and bright, and looking at her with an attention that had not diminished 1 degree in 12 months. He was freshly shaved to that close shadow, and the scar was there on his cheekbone, and he smelled of cedar and clean wool, and something warm beneath both, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. Careful and warm, and underneath both of those things, waiting. "Thank you," she said, taking the book. He did not step back. "You're the schoolteacher," he said. His voice was lower than it had been in the cell. Or perhaps it was simply that she was standing close enough to hear the full depth of it, the resonance of it, the way it settled somewhere below her collarbone. "I am. And you are the new merchant, Caleb McGee." He put his hand out, and the hand was large and steady, and she remembered when it had been white-knuckled on iron bars. She shook it. His grip was deliberate. Not hard, not testing, just present. Warm. He held her hand a beat longer than the handshake strictly required, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her wrist and into her arm, and she pulled back before it could go further. "Carol Joy Aldridge," she said. His gaze moved over her face with an unhurried thoroughness that would have been impertinent from anyone else. "Carol Joy," he said slowly. A pause, barely a breath. Something moved behind his eyes, private and deep. That's a fine name. People call me Miss Aldridge, she said, and the steadiness of her own voice was a minor personal triumph. I expect they do, he said, and smiled, the genuine version, slow and warm and crinkling at the corners. And the smile was so entirely familiar that her stomach turned over. She walked home afterwards with the unreturned book pressed to her sternum like armor, and told herself, very firmly, that she was in complete control of the situation. She was not in complete control of the situation. He appeared at church. He appeared at the social. He appeared, somehow, in the general vicinity of wherever she happened to be, with a frequency that was absolutely not coincidental, and which he maintained with such pleasant equanimity that she could never quite summon the grounds to object. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He remembered names. He had, she observed with reluctant admiration, the rare quality of making every person he spoke to feel briefly like the most interesting person in the room. He did not make her feel like the most interesting person in the room. He made her feel like the only person in the room. That was considerably worse. At the October social, he found the seat 2 places from hers at the long supper table, and she spent the entire meal exquisitely aware of the space between them. The warmth of him, close. The sound of his laugh when old Reverend Cass made a joke, unhurried, genuine. The laugh of a man who found the world genuinely amusing rather than performing amusement. Once, reaching for the bread, his forearm brushed hers on the table, a contact so brief it could not be called anything, and she felt it with a specificity that was frankly embarrassing for a woman her age. She looked down at her plate. He leaned toward her slightly. "What are you reading at the moment?" he asked, in the tone of a man resuming a conversation that had already been established. "We have not spoken enough for you to ask me that," she said. "We're speaking now, perfectly reasonable." Aqua eyes doing their work. "What are you reading?" She told him, because she was constitutionally incapable of rudeness to people who had done nothing to deserve it, and because some traitorous part of her wanted to. He had opinions about the book. They were the wrong opinions. She said so. He listened to her rebuttal with that tilted head focus and argued back, and she found herself 3 sentences in before she had made the conscious decision to engage, and the food went half cold on her plate, and Nettie Coles on her other side was visibly entertained. After supper, he walked her to the door of the church hall. "Miss Aldridge," he said, at the threshold, in the cool night air. "Mr. McGee," she said. He was looking at her in the lamplight that spilled from the open doors behind her, and his expression had shed the social ease of the evening, and was something quieter and more direct. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. "In this town." A pause, deliberate. "I've been glad of it since the day I arrived." He walked away before she could answer, which she strongly suspected was intentional. She stood in the lamplight with her pulse in her throat and the October night cool on her warm cheeks and thought, he is going to be the end of her careful gray life. She was not at all certain she minded. Mordecai Pruitt had the instincts of a man accustomed to ownership and the particular sensitivity of one who had let something go and was not entirely reconciled to the letting. He found Carol Joy at the dry goods store on a Thursday morning in November and managed to make the encounter look accidental with the skill of a man who had practiced it. "McGee's been paying you a lot of attention," he said, by way of opening. "Good morning, Mordecai," she said. "How is Sissy?" "Fine." "Carol Joy. I'm glad to hear it. There's something off about that man." He lowered his voice, glancing toward McGee's storefront across the street. "Showed up from nowhere. Cash money, no history, anyone can trace. I've made some inquiries, Mordecai." Her voice was quiet and firm, the voice she used for classroom disruptions. "You are a married man. Mr. McGee's personal history is no concern of yours. I was thinking of the town's safety." "You were thinking of me," she said, with a precision that made him look briefly away. "I appreciate that you mean well. But please don't pursue this." Part 5. The encounter continued. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not the proprietary irritation she'd expected, but something older and more complicated. The look of a man beginning to comprehend, too late, the full dimensions of what he had called lukewarm. "He's going to hurt you," Mordecai said. "Many things have hurt me," she said pleasantly. "I have survived them all." "Good morning, Mordecai." She walked away and spent the walk to school moving the encounter around in her mind like a chess problem. If Mordecai made serious inquiries, if he wrote to the right people, if someone connected the description of Caleb McGee to the outstanding warrant for Jamie Lawless, it would end badly. For everyone. She felt the cold logic of it settle over her and knew what she had to do. She had to tell him. Part 6. Without a position. The letter from the Territorial Education Board arrived on a Monday in November, in the same week as the first real frost. A qualified teacher had been secured for Briars Hollow. A Mr. Harold Finch, certified from Philadelphia, arriving in March. The board wished to extend its gratitude to Miss Aldridge for her 2 years of service and enclosed a letter of commendation and $15. Carol read it twice. Then she folded it precisely along its original lines, and set it on the table, and sat with her hands in her lap while Prescott watched her from the opposite chair. "Well," she said to the cat. Prescott blinked. "Quite," she said. She gave herself one evening of honest feeling. The schoolroom had been hers in the way that purpose belongs to a person who has lost too many other anchors, and the children were the nearest thing to family she had, and losing it was a real loss that deserved to be acknowledged before it was managed. She sat with it. She let it be large for one evening. Then she folded it up, the way she folded everything, and made a list. Her options were limited. The house was paid for. Her savings were modest. She could take in sewing, but she was a mediocre seamstress. She could offer private tutoring, which would help but not enough. Nettie arrived the following day with a copy of the Briar's Hollow Courier, folded to a specific page, and left it on the kitchen table without a word, because Nettie had always communicated most effectively in the language of objects placed deliberately in one's line of sight. Carol read the notice. McGee's General Merchants, seeking a person of education and sound organizational capacity for the position of bookkeeper and correspondence clerk. Experience with figures preferred. Compensation commensurate. Inquire at the premises. "I am not going to work for that man," she told Nettie. "Obviously not," said Nettie, and poured herself tea. She lasted 11 days. The arithmetic of her situation was not complex. There was one position in Briar's Hollow suited to her skills, and it was being advertised by the one person she was determined to keep at a sensible distance, and the universe had an evident sense of humor about sensible distances. She put on her best gray dress on a Wednesday morning and walked into McGee's General Merchants with her spine straight and her chin level. He was behind the counter sorting invoices, and he looked up when the bell above the door sounded, and his expression when he saw her was very still for a moment. The way he went still when something surprised him, before settling into a warmth he made no effort to conceal. "Miss Aldridge." There was something in his voice when he said it, a quality of pleasure held at careful volume, as though he did not entirely trust himself to speak at full volume in her direction. "I understand you require a bookkeeper," she said. "When can you start?" he said. "You haven't asked my qualifications. I don't need to." His eyes held hers across the counter with that settled, unflinching directness. "I've watched you add up Mrs. Halliday's whole order in your head at Cobb's store before he'd half finished counting it on his fingers. Your handwriting is the clearest in the county, your letters have no errors, and you taught 30 children every day for 2 years without losing your composure once." A pause. "Except for the day Billy Culpepper put a lizard in Lucy Voss's lunch pail, but I'd argue that doesn't count." The corner of his mouth moved. "When can you start?" She stared at him. "How do you know about the lizard?" "Little town, Miss Aldridge," he said, and the amusement in his voice was warm as a fire in November. "Monday," she said. "Monday it is." Part 7. What grows in close quarters? She had expected awkwardness. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by anticipating each possible species of discomfort and equipping herself with a suitable response. What she had not prepared for was how quickly the awkwardness dissolved, and what it left behind. He gave her the back room, which had a north-facing window and good light and enough space for the ledgers that were, she discovered, his greatest weakness. He was brilliant with numbers. He held them in his head in complex, interconnected systems, but he had almost no relationship with paper, and the result was a set of books that were technically accurate and practically incomprehensible. She found it deeply satisfying to untangle them. Not just the work of it, though she did love the work, the way a disorderly ledger resolved under her hands into something clean and legible, but the particular satisfaction of bringing order to something that was specifically his chaos, made comprehensible. She turned this over in her mind once, and immediately put it away in the part of her mind reserved for things she was not ready to examine. He left her alone when she needed it, and appeared in the doorway when she didn't, which struck her as either perceptive or lucky, and she suspected it was neither. He had simply been paying close attention. He came to the doorway one afternoon in her second week, coffee in each hand, and set one at the corner of her desk without being asked and leaned against the frame. In that way he had, relaxed, unhurried, taking up space without crowding, and said, "What are you reading at the moment?" "You asked me that at the social," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "You didn't give me a proper answer. You told me the title, and then got distracted, telling me why my opinion of Dickens is wrong." "Your opinion of Dickens is wrong," she said. "Walk me through it," he said, and settled against the doorframe as though he had nowhere else to be, and she looked up, and his aqua eyes were attentive and alive and fixed entirely on her face, and she walked him through it. They argued for 40 minutes. When she finally recollected herself and looked at the clock, it was 5:30, and the light through the north window had gone from gold to deep blue, and the shop had been closed for half an hour. "I should go," she said. "I'll walk you," he said. He always walked her home, and she had stopped objecting. because the truth was that the walk home, 10 minutes through the cooling evening, his long stride matched to hers. The conversation still running between them had become the best part of her day, and she was not yet ready to give it up. In the third week, a supply delivery arrived on a morning of hard frost, and she helped him unload crates because there was no one else. They worked in the bitter cold, side by side, with their breath-making ghosts in the air. She was warm anyway, warm from the work, from the exertion. And when they came back inside and he made coffee on the backroom stove, the small space felt close and comfortable and entirely insufficient as a buffer. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked up at him, and he was already looking at her, and he was close. The room was small, the stove was in the corner, they were near it by necessity, and the aqua eyes in the cold morning light were doing the thing they always did, which was to find her and stay. "Caleb," she said, and his name in her mouth was a small act of deliberate recklessness, because she had not called him by his given name before. Something shifted in his expression. Something opened. "Carol Joy," he said. "Low, private. There's something I need to tell you." She held his gaze. "Mordecai Pruitt is making inquiries about your background." She watched him go very still. "He hasn't found anything yet, but he's persistent, and he has contacts in Kansas City, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought you should know." He was quiet for a long moment. She could see the exact moment he decided not to pretend he didn't know what she meant. "Why are you telling me?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Because I believe the man who came back to this town is not the man the warrant describes. And because," she paused, "because I was there, Cal. I was there, and I watched you, and I never believed you were what they said you were." The use of the shorter name, the family name, the name before everything, landed between them like a lit match. She saw his throat move. "You've known," he said. "Since the beginning. Since the day you arrived." She did not look away. "I saw your eyes from 40 feet away and knew." The room was very quiet. Outside, Briar's Hollow went about its frost morning business, entirely unaware of the two people in the back room who were, very slowly, dismantling the last careful constructions between them. "Why didn't you tell the sheriff?" he asked. "Because you came back," she said simply. "Men who intend harm don't come back. They don't buy storefronts and learn people's names." She stopped herself. "And they don't walk schoolteachers home in the evenings. A beat. You should write to your mother, Cal. She thinks you're dead. Dead." His jaw tightened. Something crossed his face that was grief and relief at once. The expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy in private for a long time and has just been asked to set it down. "I know," he said roughly. "Write to her tonight." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the words were the same gentle, rueful deference he'd used through the bars, and she felt the echo of it across a year and had to look at her coffee. He sat down then, on the stool across from hers, and told her. All of it. His wife Mary, dead 12 years ago with the baby who had not lived to draw her first breath, in a February that had stripped everything away at once. The farm, the bank, his mother's face when he told her he was leaving to find work, the months with the wild group, the murder that sent him out alone into the dark, the years on the road, the strange solitary discipline of it, the money sent home, the day a letter came back saying the mortgage was cleared, the 6 weeks of freedom before he was recognized outside Dodge by a man who wanted the reward. He told it without self-pity, in the plain voice of a man who has made his account with himself and is now making it to the one person who has the right to hear it. Carol listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I lost both my parents," she said. 3 years ago, my mother first, then my father that autumn, and I've been alone since." She looked at the frost on the window. "I know what it is to keep being sensible, because the alternative is to feel how large the silence is." He looked at her with an expression that had no performance in it at all. "I'm sorry, Carol Joy." She nodded. Then she stood and said, with the brisk practicality she deployed when emotions had reached their permitted limit, quote, "The Harker account is a disaster. I need at least another hour with it before I can close the November ledger." "Of course," he said, and the softness in his voice as he said it followed her back to her desk and settled around her like a second coat. Part 8. Come here. Winter settled over Briar's Hollow. The temperature dropped. The days shortened. The sky went white and close, and Carol Joy Aldridge, who had spent 24 years successfully managing herself, began to lose the thread. It was not one thing. It was an accumulation. The specific accumulation of working daily beside a man who was, she had concluded with reluctant and irrevocable certainty, the most interesting person she had ever known. Not because his history was dramatic, though it was, but because of how he was in the ordinary, the way he listened, with that slightly tilted head, and his full attention, the way he remembered small things she had mentioned once, and acted on them later, without drawing attention to it, the way he treated every person who came through his door, ranch hands, widow women, children trailing their mothers, with a courtesy that was not performance because there was no audience for it. And the way he looked at her as though she were the resolution to a long difficulty. She was trying very hard not to be resolved. On a Wednesday afternoon in January, she was working on a correspondence backlog when he came into the back room in the late afternoon. She felt him stop before she looked up, which was its own problem. She had begun to feel him in space, to know when he was near with a physical awareness that had nothing to do with logic. "You've been in here 2 hours," he said. "The Kellerman letter is complicated." She did not look up. Mr. Kellerman believes he was shorted on his last 3 orders, and he is the sort of man who will convince himself of injury until he is addressed directly and formally. And the letter needs to be Carol Joy. The way he said her name, she had catalogued, with the precision she applied to everything, approximately 40 different ways he said her name, ranging from casual and everyday to this one, low and deliberate, landing somewhere below her sternum. She put the pen down. He was in the doorway, arms loose at his sides. He had stopped folding them somewhere in December, as though he had decided to give up pretending he was relaxed. And the lamp on her desk lit the left side of his face and left the right in shadow. His aqua eyes were fixed on her with an expression she had been steadfastly refusing to acknowledge for 6 weeks. "What?" she said very carefully. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to not immediately put on your professional voice and tell me about the Kellerman account." "I don't have a professional voice," she said in what was unmistakably her professional voice. The corner of his mouth moved. "You have about 5 voices," he said. "There's the classroom one, quiet, very precise. The children are right to be respectful of it. There's the one you use when Mordecai speaks to you, which is pleasant and about as warm as a closed door. There's the one you use in conversation when you forget to be careful, which I like considerably." A pause. "And then there's the one you use late in the day when we've been talking for a while and you've stopped managing the conversation, and that one." He stopped. "What?" she said, and her voice was not any of the 5 he'd described. "That one I think about," he said simply. The room was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the January dark pressed against the window. Carol Joy Aldridge stood up from her desk. She stood up because sitting felt suddenly wrong, too passive, too much the posture of a woman waiting for things to happen to her. And she had decided in the jail cell of Briar's Hollow on a sweltering afternoon that she was not that woman anymore. She crossed the small room to where he stood in the doorway, and he went very still. That same absolute gathering of attention she remembered from the bars, and she stopped in front of him, close, looking up. He was so unreasonably tall. She had to tip her head back to find his eyes, and they were right there, aqua and dark-ringed, and looking at her with an openness that cost him something. She could see the cost of it, the deliberate laying down of the careful easiness he wore like a second coat in public. What was underneath was just him. "Just this. You have no idea," she said, "how long I have been trying not to." "Not to what?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur. "Notice you," she said. He exhaled slowly, and the exhale was unsteady in a way that nothing else about him was, and she found that undoing in the precise way that strength briefly showing its limits is undoing. Carol Joy. Her name, in that register, was its own complete sentence. "Don't," she said. "Ask me if I'm sure." He reached up, unhurried, and with one careful finger pushed her spectacles up her nose where they had slipped. That gesture, so specific and domestic and entirely intimate. And then his hand stayed at her jaw, his thumb at the curve of her cheek, tilting her face up to his. He kissed her. There were no bars between them this time. There was nothing between them at all. It started soft, careful, the way he was always careful with her, a question rather than a statement, and she answered it, and the answer was not careful at all. She rose on her toes and kissed him back with a year's worth of wanting, and 6 weeks of winter evenings, and the full force of a woman who had been told she was lukewarm tea and had been quietly furious about it ever since. He made a sound against her mouth that she felt in her spine, and his arms came around her, and she was lifted slightly off the floor, and she did not object. His mouth was warm and thorough, and deliberate, in a way that made her forget the ledgers, the Kellerman letter, the entire month of January. One large hand spread across the curve of her lower back, holding her against him, and she could feel the solid warmth of him all along the length of her body, and it was nothing like lukewarm. It was nothing like anything she had a word for. She had her hands in his shirt. The pins were going from her hair. She registered this distantly, and didn't care. He kissed the corner of her mouth, her jaw, came back to her lips again with an unhurried thoroughness that made her understand, with complete and somewhat staggering clarity, that he had been thinking about this for a very long time. When they finally broke apart, she was considerably less composed than she had ever been in her adult life. Her hair was half down. Her glasses were somewhere. Her hands were still gripping the front of his shirt, and she made no immediate move to release them. "Cal," she said, against his jaw, and she felt his arms tighten around her. "Yeah," he said roughly. Not a question, just acknowledgement, like she'd said something true, and he was agreeing with it. She pulled back enough to look at him. His expression was unguarded in a way she had only seen in glimpses before, the careful ease of him entirely dissolved, replaced by something warm and certain and a little undone, fixed on her with the full attention that had been making her composure difficult since October of the previous year. "You still need to write to your mother," she said. A laugh startled out of him. The real one, the one that changed his face completely. And she felt it under her hands and smiled. And he pulled her back against him and held her with his chin resting on the top of her head, and the stove ticked, and Briar's Hollow went about its winter business entirely unaware. Epilogue: What she chose. He asked her on an October afternoon, 1 year to the day from his arrival in Briar's Hollow. He had not planned the date deliberately. Or so he claimed. Carol Joy, who had been applying her bookkeeper's precision to the evidence for some months, had her doubts. They were in the shop, the late afternoon light going amber and long across the wooden floor, the smell of cedar and leather and old paper that had become, without her quite noticing, the smell of being home. She was behind the counter helping him restock the top shelf. She was perpetually inadequate for the top shelf, and he was perpetually amused by this, and she had stopped minding, which was itself a form of intimacy. When he stepped down from the stool and turned to face her and said with very little preamble, "Marry me, Carol Joy," not quite a question. The aqua eyes were direct and certain in the October light, and his expression had that quality she had come to love best in him. No performance in it, nothing calculated, nothing held back. Just him, looking at her, asking for the thing he wanted. She looked up at him for a long moment. She thought about a sweltering afternoon in a jail cell, and iron bars cold against her bodice, and the most terrifying and wonderful 3 seconds of her life up to that point. She thought about a year of trying to forget and failing entirely. She thought about the first morning she had seen those eyes again, from a schoolroom window, and the ruler clattering on the floor. She thought about winter evenings and cold deliveries, and 40-minute arguments about Dickens that left the food cold on the table. She thought about the particular way he said her name, the low and deliberate version, the one he used only when they were alone. She thought about what Mordecai had called her, lukewarm tea. She looked at Caleb McGee, at James Calvin Lawless, who had come back across a year and a wanted poster, and the full inconvenience of geography to stand in a general merchant shop in Briar's Hollow and look at her like she was the resolution to every hard thing. And she thought, no, not lukewarm, never lukewarm, just waiting for the right person to notice the fire. Yes, she said, simply, without qualification. He reached out and removed her spectacles with care, and set them on the counter, and kissed her in the amber October light, with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity at all about what he thought of lukewarm tea. When she finally surfaced, her hair was half down, her hands were in his shirt, and old Jonas Wheeler, who had come in for tack nails, was standing in the open doorway with an expression of delighted surprise. "Mornin', Jonas," said Caleb, without releasing her. "Afternoon," said Jonas, and backed out tactfully. Carol Joy buried her face in Caleb's chest and laughed. The real laugh, the one that surprised her, the one that had been waiting a long time to come out. And he held her and laughed with her, and outside Briar's Hollow went about its October business, golden and dusty and entirely ordinary. She had gone into that jail cell a gray woman in a gray dress, looking at the floor. She came out of it something else. It had taken her a year and a half to understand what. Herself, finally. Entirely.